The effects are...
Okay, I'm here with Evan Anderson, who needs no introduction at this point, and Kevin Montgomery, who should have a very long introduction, but I'm going to skip that because you have that in your book. But I would point out that Kevin founded Collaborate.org, which came out of FiRe, and so I thought I'd give him just 30 seconds or so to tell us what Collaborate.org is.
Sure. So what if everybody in the world could actually work together to solve the world's problems and be empowered by technology to make that really easy? Usually when I'm giving talks, I'll ask, how many people in here want to change the world? In a room like this, everyone's hands would go up. But then asking people, how many people in the last week have actually done something about it? Usually only about a quarter of the hands. So what if you had a website that made it where people could self-aggregate into groups and be powered with video conferencing and chat and file sharing and all those sort of collaborative tools, but also, as what you're about to see, data, big data. 2.5 million layers of data of every sort, and then the visualization tools for them to be able to understand it. So everything from climate change, pandemic, human trafficking, or even IP theft, people could all work together no matter where they are in the world and what organization they're part of to be able to actually make an impact.
So that's why Kevin's here, for this cool data visualization. And this session is a follow-on to the morning session that Evan was on, dealing with innovation. And you'll remember the construct of the 1x, 2x, 4x, 8x, going from the asset builders to service providers, technology creators, network orchestrators, with the equity markets valuing enterprises more highly as you sort of move up that hierarchy. So that gets into sort of how wealth is created, and the key role of innovation. But then there's the issue of where does that innovation and wealth flow. So Evan, we discussed innovation earlier. How does the global distribution of innovation relate to the flow of stolen intellectual property?
Right, so we're going to show you a visualization in a moment, but what we've done is we've taken our database of intellectual property thefts, which goes back to about 2001, and hopefully at some point we'll get even farther back so we can see some more long-term trends, but we'll have our modern data set and we'll watch where it's flowing, and I think you'll find it quite startling. It relates a lot to the things we covered this morning in the panel about innovation. I mean, if the asset of innovation is intellectual property, and intellectual property is being stolen at a massive rate and shifted, then what we're going to see here is a flow of essentially the future promise of the kinds of returns that Bill was talking about. So when you look at those 8x multipliers, you don't want them to be flowing out of your country. And so we're going to be looking at a significant number of data points from our database that we've geotagged, and then geotagged the destination. And this is all from publicly disclosed information. So we'll get into some of the specifics about the visualization in a minute, and describe part of what you're going to be seeing. But the red arrows that you'll be seeing initially are the documented, publicly disclosed thefts. And that's going to be important and relevant in a second here.
And so before we get into that, at sort of a higher level, how do you measure this theft?
So we've been measuring it by creating this database. We thought that someone ought to track it and track it publicly. Unfortunately, there's not as many as we wish events that result in the theft of intellectual property that are actually documented in the public sphere. But what we've done is conglomerated all public documentation, all news articles that actually document, and all legal cases that document theft, that's confirmed theft, and we've created a database of it running back to about 2000, 2001.
Mm-hmm. So, Kevin, describe for us what we're about to see here.
Okay, so what we've done is we've taken the database from Evan and we've uploaded it into Collaborate.org, and then we're going to use our worldwide viewer. It looks kind of like Google Earth, but it's kind of Google Earth on steroids. And what we're going to be visualizing there is all the individual cases that were in Evan's database will be the red arrows that you see. Then you will also see purple arrows, which are the known but not publicly disclosed cases of IP theft, ones that were privately disclosed but are real. And then you will see black arrows for those that are projected IP thefts that are not publicly known and were not disclosed.
Right, so Intel estimates usually say that about 90% of the intellectual property theft that goes on is not even understood by the victims themselves. So that estimate is what we all should really be afraid of. It's also an obviously problematic that a number of cases of intellectual property theft are not disclosed by the companies who are the victims. And it's understandable because when they do, our current stock system, our equity system immediately punishes any CEO who discloses what's just happened.
Well, if they disclose major intellectual property theft, it suggests their future earnings may not be what was previously thought, and also doesn't necessarily speak well toward their internal systems either.
And yet there are estimates that every Fortune 500 firm has been hacked and successfully breached. So I think that our society probably ought to do a little bit of thinking in our corporate world about how we deal with this as a group, because if each individual is ostracized for declaring something to be true that is indeed true, we've got an issue. And if everyone's going through the exact same process, that issue belongs to us all.
So give us a sense of the scale here of let's say, the total magnitude of the problem. How much of that is known by the victims, what percentage, and then of that, how much would you say is actually then disclosed publicly?
Right, so about 90% is unknown. Of the 10% that is found and actually understood by the victims, only 10% of that is publicly disclosed. So 90% of that, which is represented by purple arrows in the visualization we'll be looking at, is stuff that goes on that companies understand and know about and find as breaches, but don't disclose. We all just probably saw the headline about the Yahoo breach, which they waited to disclose their breach. And many companies do. It's understandable. They suffer a lot when they disclose a breach, but it's good to know. And there are a lot of questions being asked right now about the legal ramifications that maybe should be in place if you do not disclose to your clients that you've been breached.
I was just surprised that Yahoo had 500 million user accounts. Okay, so should we go ahead and anything else?
No, I think we'll show it, and then I can to a little bit about what they're seeing.
Okay.
The challenges of the visualization.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Or would you rather describe that first?
No.
We'll go ahead and watch it.
Let's let them see it, and then I'll describe it.
Let's have a look at this, and then we can talk about what we saw.
So you want to give dates on this? This is about 2000. So in the upper inset, you can see where the IP theft is going to. This is early 2000, 2003 probably at this point, and then you see it start to progress more. So again, the red arrows are the known cases, purple are the known but not publicly disclosed, and the black are the estimated highly correlated, highly likely.
And are we seeing everything, or is this, were you able to visualize all this?
This is the aha moment.
It is a bit like a big vacuum cleaner, yeah. So the color coding on the countries is the innovation index scores on a color spectrum between most and least innovative.
So that's the giant sucking sound. And here are the locations where someone was going in Russia. We just zoomed into various locations.
We had a couple outlying data points based on some complicated cases in Europe.
And then going into 13 different cities within China. By far, it dwarfed everything else.
So that looked like China was the biggest problem.
Yeah, by far.
Evan, of the total problem, how big a part of it would you say was China?
Well, Verizon estimates that about 96% of the cases originate in China, the ones that we can document. And I mean, as this clearly shows, we've got a problem with documentation and attribution as well. There's a lot going on that we can't trace, and that's constantly an issue in the security world. But I would assume that there are other actors who are better, the Russians come to mind, at hiding their actions. Particularly in the last 10 years, things have quieted down more in terms of blatant smash and grab jobs coming out of China. For a long time, those were coming on almost a weekly basis.
So what do you mean by blatant smash and grab?
Light techniques that were not, highly technical in terms of cyber theft. Really unfortunately blatant attempts to leave airports with large bundles of documents. The FBI has done a great job.
So sort of physical grab.
Literal physical stealing.
Okay.
I mean, a good example of a classic smash and grab job that we saw not too long ago, which is the kind of thing I think they will do less in the future based on our current responses from our government. T-Mobile in Seattle had some researchers come in. They were supposed to look at the lab, understand the lab that T-Mobile had in Bellevue. What they ended up doing was stealing parts out of the machine in the lab, which was called Tappy, and it was a testing device to test smartphone screens for touch sensitivity. And I mean, clearly that's a competitive advantage aspect to building a smartphone if it actually works when you touch it. So they really wanted that technology. They were told that they couldn't bring more than 2 people into the lab at one time. They faked key cards and then brought in more people and then stole parts of it and then denied it when they were called after they had left the lab and asked if they had stolen parts of it. They were caught on camera stuffing the parts into their handbags, and running out. And they went to a hotel room, and then they were supposedly sitting there, I believe caught, live streaming while they're measuring the parts back to Beijing, going, okay, it's this many dimensions and
Were these Chinese employees of?
Yeah, they were employees of Huawei, and they just came right in and just did whatever they had intended to do. So that is so blatant that it almost defies belief. But I think that we'll see a lot less of that, and there will be a lot more quiet behind-the-scenes stuff going on, which there always has been. Mm-hmm. But in terms of the sheer quantity of inexperienced people coming in just to steal whatever they can get their hands on, that era may be coming to an end. It doesn't give me great hope that we may just not know what is being stolen because they've gotten more professional about it. I also wonder how much they already have. I mean, it's a large quantity. So if you're going to be building copycat companies out of that information, then you've got a long way to go before you're done with what you've already stolen based on the map that we just saw.
So what's your sense right now of how good the thieves are at hiding their tracks?
I think, one, I'm not a security guy specifically, so I wouldn't claim to be an expert on their ability to hide their tracks. But when I talk to security professionals, that's what they inevitably tell me is that they're getting better at concealing what they're doing. Mm-hmm. So they're getting better at wiping their footprints. They used to just be quite blatant, and people would find breaches from 10 years back that were just not that well hidden, but they hadn't been looking for them. So that's been an issue.
Well, with the Russian breach of the DNC emails, in those cases, it seemed the security experts and the U.S. government were pretty confident that they were able to track that back. And you've seen that in the past with China as well, where it apparently hasn't been that hard to trace it back.
It has, and that's, I think, why there are so many cases that would be on this database where they certifiably traced backwards. Mm-hmm. So it is actually astounding. Not only are there many unknown cases, but there's a lot of cases that probably belong in this data set that we're not putting in there yet because we want to have it truly attributed before we place it.
Well, and then if the breach is discovered, presumably it may take additional work to go and try to track it back, and do the victims necessarily do that?
Well, there's a lot of different strategies that companies take, but yeah, sometimes they really just don't. And getting into the deep and expensive process of trying to take on that kind of security usually belongs in the Fortune 500 circle. Mm-hmm. It's really hard for young companies to deal with this kind of problem in any way. And at Fortune 500s, there's a lot of insider threats. So, we talk about cyber a lot in the news cycle because it's exciting and it's new. But a lot of the espionage that occurs, about 80% of it is still occurring in traditional human intelligence ways. And what that means is you've actually got pretty much sleeper cells that come from cohorts that are trained in universities to bring technology back. And they go and work at Fortune 500 companies for 10 years, 20 years, and then bring stuff back. And sometimes they're sending it while they're working there, and sometimes they're just collecting things. But there's an immense problem with insider threats just from normal hires.
Then there's the old, really old school, low tech money and hookers. One of the cases just, I think last week I was reading about was just that. Kevin?
One of the things that I had happen out of our labs at Stanford, and some of you might have run into this too, about every 3 weeks I would get an email from a fully funded postdoc from one of these countries that we mentioned offering to come and work in my lab for free. All the time, every 3 weeks. Mostly China, sometimes some of the other countries as well.
Beware the free lunch.
And I think I'll tell you, even at Stanford, we're incredibly naive with respect to that being an insider threat and the transfer of that technology. And I think maybe in Silicon Valley in general, we don't really think about that as much as we should.
Mm-hmm. And then how big a role is the U.S. government now playing in working with companies to try to make them aware of the problem, but also to try to help them deal with it?
I think that there's a building role. It's been difficult, particularly since the Snowden days, for private companies to trust the government, and it's been difficult for the government to agree to do exactly what private companies want. And they both have, I think, very equally valid opinions on certain aspects of that dynamic. But we have a problem, which is that we live in a democracy. Mm-hmm. And if we're facing a top-down, do it or don't do it kind of system, a binary system that gets things done very quickly, we sit around debating, what we want to do about it. And we're having good conversations about that. These are important conversations to be having, but we should also be aware that the longer we have them, the more we're falling behind.
Well, I was impressed that it came up in the presidential debate on Monday, which is, it should indicate a growing awareness of the problem, at least.
Yeah, what I would like to see going out is a less simplified version of this story in the public sphere. I think if we could bring the public's attention away from the immediate, exciting, they're taking stuff, which is very important, to what do we do about it. Mm-hmm. We could build a bit more of a political and private consensus in the nation and in the Western world about creating disincentives. Because actually you and I were talking, Russ, at lunch about the fact that you can't be surprised that someone's doing this if you're not stopping them and you're not giving them any reason to stop. Well, it's a very profitable enterprise.
And going way back, the United States was built on ripping off technology from England. Back then it was, industrial era technology, but usually if people can get their hands on a better mousetrap, they will.
Yeah, there's been a long history of people copying each other's technology. One of the things that I think makes this so different is the kind of stuff that we're talking about, where we've built, over the past 200 years, an industrial system on a mutual assumption in the Western world that we needed to stop doing that kind of stuff. And we built things like the WTO because we believed that we would all be better off if we didn't do it the way we used to do it. A problem of this scale coming in to a system like that, where we've all built our academic systems and our private company systems based on ideas of sharing.
The rule of law.
And rule of law and encouraging innovation by not blatantly ripping each other off is impossible to overstate in a lot of ways, because the sheer scale of it alone threatens the way that we do things. And we really need to think about whether that's something that we want to continue.
So if innovation represents future wealth, how would you even sort of quantify the magnitude of the wealth transfer that we're talking about?
I would say that, first of all, it's almost impossible to quantify, but when we try, it's horrifying. What you're talking about is not the lowball estimates that we've heard at times. We had people that using methodology I would not support came up with $300 billion a year. It's not, because they're forgetting about every other important aspect of it. If you're talking about destroying someone's incentive to innovate, if you're talking about destroying jobs that have ripple effects throughout the economy and destroy other supporting types of employment in the area, you're talking in the trillions. Mm-hmm. I've recently seen better estimates that are talking in the trillions, but we're still getting there. People still, for a long time, thought that we were talking about small amounts of money. And we're talking about massive amounts of money and unpredictably massive amounts of money out into the future. If you destroy innovation, you're never going to know what possibilities just went away. So if we lose our innovating firms, we're losing things we don't even understand.
It's not just the resources and everything that went into developing that technology, but the opportunity cost and the opportunity lost that I think is probably a lot larger, right?
You don't know the innovation that wasn't undertaken.
Yeah, never know.
So what were the problems, Kevin, that you were working with in visualizing this?
So this is something I think Chris Johnson will appreciate too. One of our biggest problems with visualizing this data set, and then I'll have a surprise for you, is the sheer magnitude of the problem. So here was what we were trying to do. We knew the location where the IP was created. We knew where it ended up. We were trying to draw arrows between them, as you saw. We then needed to put more arrows going between the locations. So we had a trajectory, and we put more and more arrows on. That wasn't enough. Then we had to make more paths of trajectories around, and that wasn't enough. And we added more and more and more to the point where, can I drop the bomb?
Yeah.
What you saw in this video, well, we should maybe show it again, is only 10% of the data. We couldn't visualize that many arrows on the screen, or the screen was black.
You wouldn't see any countries.
You wouldn't see any countries anymore.
Yeah.
We just could not visualize that. And imagine, so in the video that you're seeing, imagine every arrow there being 10 inventors working for years building up that technology. All the resources that goes into it, all the opportunity cost that's lost now that Evan was talking about.
So right now we're just seeing what's going to China, right?
No, we're seeing our entire database of public.
Oh yeah, I see
Yeah,
it.
you see
Okay,
some
we
are
see it going
There's a
into
bit
Russia.
going to Russia, and there's a bit of interplay between other nations.
Yeah, okay.
And this is where the screen just goes black. You'll see in a second, just if we try to visualize everything.
There's such a rush of data, yeah.
And it's increasing in speed. There's just no way to visualize it.
Interesting. Going from India, is that going from India into China as well?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
If anybody wants to ask questions, line up at the mic or look for a microphone before we transition into that. See a bit going into England there, huh? Is that going into England?
Mm-hmm. We had a complicated case. It's kind of a data outlier, but it's an interesting case.
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah, can we, maybe we should do Q&A.
yeah, sure. Go ahead.
We turn that mic on.
Stealing IP theft,
Threat-wise?
if you're going to steal the IP theft, what are the top ways that it is escaping the country?
Yep.
And what do we have to work on first?
So yeah, as I was saying, insider threat is actually an incredibly large problem. And traditional espionage, the real physical stealing of information, not just cyber theft, are huge problems. And we got excited about cyber theft because it was growing as an issue, and it was important, and it was new, and it was dangerous. But we also, I think, tend to lose in our news cycle the fact that there are a lot of actual spies in our companies. I've seen estimates at about 30,000, but I actually personally think it's higher by quite a bit. I've seen some really great data done by some people that I can't release that we're getting better at tracking these things. We're getting better at understanding what the profile of someone who's in one of those cohorts looks like, and where they're coming from, and who's training them, and all of that. The government is certainly deep into that. And we've got a lot more a building private industry doing the same thing for companies, which is incredibly important. And that's I think, another place where we'll need to have a lot more collaboration in the future. I think that the FBI has done an excellent job of trying to track these people. It's incredibly hard because there are so many of them. There's just such an overwhelming volume, just like in general with the theft, and just like with cyber theft. The volume is so high that it's difficult to pay that many personnel just to track people.
To what extent is this prosecuted?
It's prosecuted to the extent that they can prove that there's something going on. Mm-hmm. But we've got a lot of people with the intention to steal that we haven't caught at the airport with a document folder yet. So they're prosecuting cases, I think, about as fast as they can, but they have to build a case. And when you've got 30,000 people staring you in the face doing it, and you've got to build each case, and it takes years,
and then
that's a complicated problem.
And to what extent can this be addressed through self-help retaliation? I seem to recall reading about Google taking it upon themselves on occasion to swat at the perpetrators?
I think a lot of companies are either doing that or sorely tempted to because our system has not met their needs so far. I certainly don't blame private companies for wanting to actually go to the root of the problem. There are problems with that approach, and you end up with a lot of problems if you're getting into a world of vigilantism. The world that we want to see at INVNT IP doesn't necessitate that kind of action. So we want to see companies that in the short term, yes, are much safer. I would personally speak to the idea that they just need to be watching their security a lot more, building up strong defenses and active defenses, which is kind of a newer concept. The firewall doesn't cut it, and it's important that we all know that. We need active monitoring teams, and the best companies have them. But in terms of what world we want to live in, I would say that we want a world in which private companies do not become vigilantes and start zapping networks all around the world.
I would bet on Google against the perpetrators.
That's a tough bet when you're talking about a nation state with
that's true.
a few $100 billion behind them.
Yeah. Next question.
I'm thinking about the slide earlier where we were talking about GDP and how to look at it in terms of innovation. And I guess help me to understand the case if I'm Vladimir Putin or I'm running China, why wouldn't I want to steal everything? So help me understand that case.
Because you were disincentivized. So that's part of what we would like to see at INVNT IP. Currently, that's exactly what you said, which is why wouldn't they, is exactly our problem. We have been just hoping that they wouldn't, and that's not good enough. We should normally have WTO legislation that would stop this kind of thing. Unfortunately, we let China accede to the WTO without meeting their standards. They still don't meet their standards. In fact, a lot of what we're describing is very clearly illegal by WTO standards. Normally, that would be solved in the WTO, and between any other nations, these cases regularly do get solved. But the nature of our relationship and the lack of meeting of standards by China creates a really, really difficult dynamic there. And so in that way, our international trade system has failed us. We need to create economic disincentives because it is an economic problem, and there's no point in discussing it as though it's just bad because it's not going to get anything done. So as soon as we make it not worth it for them, and there are a number of ways we could do that, and in fact we've done it before with other nations, as soon as we make it not worth it, that's when we'll start seeing real change.
We probably have time for one more question or two very quick questions.
Well, this is
It's on.
It's on.
good. This is a naive question, but clearly we're getting more sophisticated at both prevention and tracking, monitoring of activity. Are there other things the companies could be doing around being better at innovation or somehow being more sophisticated about what they do next and outstepping, sort of keeping one step ahead or that kind of thing?
Yeah, I think I was just talking to someone the other day about my favorite solution set that I've heard of, one of many, but my favorite, just for the playfulness of it, is misinformation. Because what you're dealing with is a nation state. So, in fact, a lot of the guys that used to be in the government intel community start private firms now and start advising companies about this. And it's fun to watch because a lot of them understand the problem in that way better because they've dealt with nation states and they understand it. So, hearing about companies creating fake IP that's garbage, that will mislead a thief into doing years of R&D in a completely garbage direction is, for me, playful, in a way.
And that goes way back. I have a couple teenage daughters, and I like to read the books that they're reading. And one of my favorite was Paper Towns by John Green. And the Paper Towns refers to in the old days of road maps, where to protect their intellectual property, the map makers would put in fictitious towns. Little towns in the middle of nowhere so that they would know if somebody copied their map. So maybe we need to do more of that as well.
Yeah, I think we're getting a lot better at that kind of thing, and I have a lot of hope for that.
Okay, we're up. Thanks.
Thanks.